What's happening, everybody? Ryan Thomas live on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. It has been a bit since I have hopped on the podcast to talk sports topics, and ranging from the Buffalo Bills, NFL football, Major League Baseball, the Washington Nationals. What a run they have gone on as we head into the World Series, possibly with the Nationals, and the Astros and Yankees are still a little bit undecided. But also a sport that you guys that have tuned into the show for the last 4 years know that I love to talk about, love to discuss, love to analyze, is the sport of mixed martial arts. And tonight, ESPN put together a phenomenal 30 for 30 called Chuck and Tito, titled Chuck and Tito. And if you're not an MMA fan, I would highly suggest that you watch it. If you're a new MMA fan, I would also highly suggest that you watch it, because I think in order to understand or in order to appreciate anything, you have to learn where it came from. Where did it all start? How did it all go down? How did this sport known as mixed martial arts become what it is today? And Chuck and Tito are two reasons on their own why the sport of mixed martial arts is where it is today, why the sport grew to the level that it did. And, to kind of take myself back, because every single time I watch a Chuck Liddell highlight or a Chuck Liddell fight or a Tito Ortiz fight, or really anytime I see either one of these gentlemen in an interview or anything like that, it really takes me back to my fandom and how it really started, and what made me really essentially fall in love with the sport of mixed martial arts were these two fighters, among guys like Matt Hughes, Dan Henderson, George St. Pierre, Randy Couture, Andrei Arlovsky was another one of those guys, Rich Franklin was another one of those guys. But Chuck Liddell and Tito were more than a rivalry. They were something really, really special. And I say that, to a lot of fight fans. I loved the Anderson Silva-Chael Sonnen rivalry. I thought that rivalry was piping hot at that time, and it was really needed at that time for Anderson Silva. And Chael Sonnen, I think, is probably the greatest talker that's ever been in the game, in the MMA fight game, including Conor McGregor. But Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz were something different. That there was just the way this story kind of played itself out is truly something special. I don't even think the average movie writer could write a better story in comparison to what actually took place. And I think in MMA today, we see a lot of fighters that are great fighters. We see a lot of fighters that have the ability to talk on the mic. We see a lot of fighters that can fight, that love to go toe-to-toe, that love to say this, love to say that, but they actually truly are kind of talking out of their you-know-what. Whereas Chuck Liddell, at the very least, was everything that he advertised himself as. He was a true fighter. He was a guy that wanted to go toe-to-toe, that wanted to, really mess up his opponent. And Tito Ortiz was this guy that was just a showman. He wanted to come out, really bring a lot of attention to the sport, really bring a new audience to the sport, and promote the sport from within his fighting. Not necessarily let his fighting do the talking for his promotion like Chuck, but let his talking, add to the hype of his fight, which created a really awesome story. And I think the best thing about that rivalry is knowing that I got a chance to see that while it was actually happening. I was one of the few, people in my generation, here I am, 27, 28 next April, that were watching that at that time, watching the UFC at that time, watching these fights take place at that time as if they were, fights that will happen next week. And it really just puts a smile on my face, because I think that the UFC is not as obscure as it was then. and almost that obscurity or that I don't know, that look down upon factor of the sport. I almost missed that. That was one of my biggest takeaways from watching this documentary, is that I miss the obscurity that the UFC was in. I miss the fact that you were kind of an outcast if you liked the UFC or if you liked MMA. Now it's a mainstream sport, to say the least. It's a juggernaut. And Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz are two reasons why. And for all the great rivalries that the sport has seen since Chuck and Tito, it's almost as if Chuck and Tito were really the first true rivalry in the sport of MMA. The true rivalry where they really did not like each other. And most of those reasons were because they knew that they were standing in each other's way of what they wanted. Chuck wanted to beat Tito to get to the title, and Tito wanted to beat Chuck to get his belt back. Ultimately, that's how the timeline of everything, throughout their careers kind of ensued. And even years after the fact of them knowing that, hey, we're a little older now, but we still have this fight that we could sell, that we can make money off of. And, that was a box office disaster due to the fact that Chuck Liddell, 38 at the time he retired, comes back at 48. I don't think we could have seen a greater fall for a superstar in MMA history the way we did with Chuck Liddell. I'll say this forever. When I talk about MMA, when I talk about mixed martial arts, whether it's on this podcast or even, when I, hopefully down the line have, a son or even a daughter that is attracted to the sport of MMA, I can always say that Chuck Liddell was the perfect example of a champion, a guy that wanted to go out there, wanted to fight the best, wanted to earn his shot, get his shot, take his shot, and become the champion, and also represent the sport the right way. I mean, obviously he was engulfed in fame and fortune and was a true rock star, but at the same time was somebody that you knew was just an all-around good guy. Came from a hardworking background, came from some very tough circumstances as well, which, as far as the 30 for 30 went, not to spoil anything, but I thought the 30 for 30 did a real good job of illustrating Tito Ortiz, his background, what he went through, and also illustrating what Chuck Liddell went through. His mother was shot at by his father when his mother was pregnant with Chuck Liddell, and that was something I never knew. That was a story that I'd never, picked up on in any of, anything that I've read or watched. And to know that these guys are honestly two real guys that really enjoyed fighting, that ultimately crossed paths. And I think there's something to be said for just the state of the UFC at that time. Really tough, trying circumstances that were not what the UFC really wanted. And they tried to do everything and anything that they could to save the sport, and yet it was treading water. And here you had Chuck Liddell, Tito Ortiz, that rivalry playing itself out, and then that rivalry allowed Chuck to eventually fight Randy, and then all that happened, and it really put things in perspective as far as the stardom that these guys created for the UFC, the stardom that they created for guys like Randy Couture. I mean, we wouldn't really be talking about Randy Couture at that time. No one was talking about Randy Couture unless he was, fighting Tito Ortiz or Chuck Liddell. I mean, Randy did win the heavyweight title, but he moved down to fight at light heavyweight, and then moved back up to heavyweight eventually, but moved down to light heavyweight, and really he hadn't been really talked about outside of his fights with Vitor, Chuck, and Tito. But I find it so amazing that these two guys are going to be forever intertwined due to the fact that they fought 3 times, due to the fact that Chuck beat him 2 times. Really, the 2 fights that Chuck won were the fights where both of these guys were in their primes. And Chuck Liddell's last win, although it was against Wanderlei Silva, I believe his last win where he was truly in his prime, where he was not doubted by anybody, where he was really fighting and firing on all cylinders in Chuck Liddell fashion, was that win over Tito Ortiz more than a few years back. But his in the rematch that helped him defend the UFC light heavyweight championship. Chuck Liddell, I will always have respect for that guy. Tito Ortiz, some of the things outside of the octagon, I never understood really as a kid, but now looking back on it, understanding the business of mixed martial arts and understanding the fight game a little bit better, you kind of understand what Tito was trying to do. You kind of understand that he was just trying to make as much money as humanly possible. And the company did sell for $4.25 billion, largely due to the fact that, Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz helped put that UFC together, as the UFC. Whether it was Dana White and the Fertitta brothers that bought it, Chuck and Tito were 2 entities in and of itself that were arguably bigger than the UFC at that time. So I look at this whole situation and I say to myself, the whole 30 for 30, a lot of the stuff in the 30 for 30 was stuff that I already knew, but in terms of the fights and what happened and how the rivalry came about, but really it painted a picture of what type of people Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz are. 2 guys that, are true fighters, 2 guys that have fought from the moment they were born on this earth. 2 guys with very, very rough backgrounds that were able to make something out of their MMA careers into something special, into something that the fans could really enjoy. And, like Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, I think Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz will be synonymous with each other for the rest of their lives. And I don't think either guy would want it any other way. I mean, how many guys can say that they're etched in history with another fighter, whether they won those fights, whether they lost those fights, just to be etched in stone as one of the guys that paved the way for this great sport to be what it is today. I'm truly honored for the fact that I got to watch it as a young kid, and the fact that I've watched mixed martial arts ever since, due to the fact that these 2 guys really cemented in my mind. I remember watching on my TV, I was maybe 8 or 9, maybe 10 or 11, watching Tito Ortiz with the flames on his trunks, and Chuck Liddell with the ice on his trucks, the Iceman with the icicles on his trunks, the Iceman, and the Huntington Beach Bad Boy. I mean, doesn't get much better than that. I feel like a lot of fans that listen to this show, a lot of my friends maybe that listen to this show, a lot of people that I know that know that I love MMA, but I know they don't love MMA. I would really encourage you to watch this, really encourage you to dive into this, watch this 30 for 30, and you will have a much, much better understanding of why this sport is so big and how it got big. It was on the backs of guys like Chuck Liddell, guys like Tito Ortiz, guys like Royce Gracie, who it was really cool to see him make an appearance during the 30 for 30. I always like seeing what he has to say. He is really the true original Ultimate Fighter. And you get a lot of crucial figures inside the sport of mixed martial arts that really made this sport rise from the depths of hell into one of the top entities in the world. I mean, the UFC is one of the biggest companies in the world today, and it's largely because of these fighters, and it also adds the narrative and the question that these fighters deserve to be paid for their contributions to the sport for the rest of their lives. I mean, yeah, it's quote just cage fighting, where 2 half-naked men, in their case, stepped into the cage and swapped sweat, blood, and tears. But at the same time, they were not paid at the level of, a Conor McGregor. And the same can be said for baseball. The same can be said for football. And the same can be said for basketball. The real, true, influential figures of those sports didn't get paid the money that, a Conor McGregor made. And I think the most troubling, facet of the 30 for 30 that I saw is the fact that Liddell versus Ortiz 3 only had 25,000 pay-per-view buys. I mean, that's very sad. It's one of the lowest, pay-per-view purchased fight cards in MMA history. 25,000. So it's sad. And another factor in that is that Chuck Liddell is undecided about his fighting future. I would really hope that I never do see Chuck Liddell fight again, because he honestly, I've never met the man, but as a fight fan, the guy means too much to me as a fan, and to the writers and to media members. Myself as a fan, as a writer, as a podcast host, I hope Chuck Liddell never fights again. I hope this guy does decide that his time is up. He's a great guy, can do so many other things. It's just he's a true fighter, and Dana White said it best. There's people in place to protect people like Chuck Liddell from Chuck Liddell. A fighter's greatest enemy is oftentimes himself, but a fighter's greatest weakness also is often himself. Chuck Liddell is just a true badass, a true fighter. God bless him. God love him. I wish the best for him and his family, but this man should not be fighting anymore. He's done enough. He's done more than enough, and there's just no need for him to go down that road. But it's a lot easier said than done. When you have that glory, when you have that fame, it's a tough pill to swallow to accept that it's over. Even Tito Ortiz is having a tough time accepting that it's over. He's fighting in Combate Americas versus Alberto Del Rio December 7th, which, take that for what it's worth. No disrespect to Tito, but even Tito should probably be done fighting as well. What better win to go out of in your MMA career than even a Chael Sonnen or even a Chuck Liddell? It is what it is. But needless to say all that, I greatly admire these two guys for what they did for the sport of MMA. It has changed my life, as a sports fan, as a kid growing up, seeing MMA for the first time. I thought to myself, oh my God, there's nothing like this. What is this? And it just turned into this obsession where I have an office in my upstairs in my house, and I have, paintings or posters, just things hanging on the wall that are all sports oriented. And I have a poster of Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz, and that was from their first fight. So that just goes to show you that, I'm a sports historian to say the least, but Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz is that type of fight that will always be watched on my UFC Fight Pass. But it will always be one that I will always remember, and always one that will stand the test of time, no matter what. The first two, not the third one. Third one should never have happened, but it's neither here nor there. I really enjoyed the 30 for 30. I thought it was great. Thought it was a good time watching it. And I hope that, you watch it too. That's my biggest statement on this podcast tonight. You watch it too. Enjoy it, understand it, and love it. I'm Ryan Thomas. It was the Thomas Take. You can follow me on Twitter at Ryan Thomas Take. Follow me on Instagram at Ryan Thomas Take. And join the takeover. Greatly enjoying this podcast as always. Greatly enjoy hearing from you, the viewers and listeners. Tomorrow morning, I'll be back on to discuss Jalen Ramsey being traded from the Jacksonville Jaguars to the Los Angeles Rams.